Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Petrick, Senior Director of Research for VISTAGE. I'm happy to host this latest webinar in our Leading in Challenging Times series. This series provides the definitive source of thought leadership on pressing topics facing small and mid-sized businesses. Combining expert insights from speakers like we have today with peer perspectives is how VISTAGE helps members make critical decisions that drive growth. Today's focus is on the impact of implicit bias during the hiring process. We've invited Inspirity's Aisha Tompkins to discuss the negative impact unconscious biases have in the workplace, particularly in the areas of recruiting, promotions, and inclusivity, and how to prevent them from negatively affecting the organization. Aisha has over 16 years of HR experience in both public and private sectors. Her areas of expertise are EEO law, employment best practices, leadership development, diversity and inclusion, and organizational leadership. Aisha, we look forward to hearing your insights. Over to you.
Thank you, Ann. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on what side of the country you are on. As Ann mentioned, my name is Aisha Tompkins, and I am the Director of EEO and Diversity and Inclusion Services with Inspirity. Inspirity's EEO Services Department assists our clients whenever they are facing any type of claims of discrimination or harassment, to include sexual harassment for our clients. We service our clients by responding to any type of regulatory charges that we may receive by way of a position statement. We also assist our clients in representing them with their mediations and search for some type of resolution for settlements or agreements. And we also serve as the point of contact between our clients and any type of opposing counsel who may have submitted some type of threatened litigation or attorney demand letter. I've been in this EEO world for about 16 years now, but recently I've added an extra focus of expertise in my arsenal, that in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I provide leadership and oversight to Inspirity's diversity, equity, and inclusion team as well, to assist our clients with their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and efforts. I'm extremely honored to be here today to discuss a topic that I believe is the driving force for a company's diversity, inclusion, and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, that being the area of recruiting. And I'm equally excited to talk about a dynamic that influences every walk of our life, and that dynamic being implicit biases. Now, you'll often hear implicit bias and unconscious bias used interchangeably, but for today's purposes, we will be using the term implicit bias. So I am going to move off of screen so that way you can focus on the slides for today. And just a little sidebar, yes, that is me before I cut off all of my hair. So we'll get right into it. So for our agenda today, we are planning to discuss, or I want to discuss with you, the following topics, which I hope will lead you to having further discussions within your individual organizations. We're going to talk about how implicit biases occur and how to prevent them from happening. We're going to talk about the impact of implicit biases to an organization, the benefits of diversity and inclusion, strategies to help reduce and remove implicit biases in hiring, and also the responsibilities of recruiters, hiring managers, and business leaders. I apologize, I'm having some technical difficulty. Okay, there we go. All right, so what exactly is implicit bias? Implicit bias is an unconscious belief, stereotype, or attitude toward any social group. Implicit biases cause us to attribute certain qualities or characteristics, whether they be positive or negative, to a particular group. Implicit biases operate on an unconscious level. We don't even realize we're making the generalizations or categorizations. Now, explicit biases are prejudicial. Explicit biases are intentional, and explicit biases are controllable. Implicit biases are our brain's tendency to try to simplify the world. We are constantly trying to sift through and make sense of the overwhelming amount of information our brains take in on a second by second basis. According to peoplegoal.com, the brain can consciously process 40 pieces of information per second, but the brain can unconsciously process 11 million pieces. Implicit biases allows the brain to take shortcuts from analyzing all the information that we are constantly bombarded with and resort to making decisions or taking actions not based on an analysis of the information that's presented to us, but on the patterns, associations, generalizations, and stereotypes that have been formed in our brains from previous experiences or other influences. Implicit biases are time-saving techniques that our brains so desperately want to use. Let me try to simplify this with an example. Let's say a company is looking to create a new software utilizing all the latest and cutting-edge technology and apps available. The best choice would be to seek the assistance of a millennial or Generation Zer and not a baby boomer, right? I mean, they are the generation that was born with technology in their hands. Now, while this could be an accurate assumption, it's not always the case. Making this kind of assumption is an example of our implicit bias, stereotypical, or generalized thinking that we unconsciously carry. Although the thinking may appear to make sense, evaluating competency based on age is a common mistake that could potentially sacrifice the quality, innovation, and wisdom of a more seasoned employee and could potentially make a company susceptible to an age discrimination claim. So to avoid this, employers should make decisions based on facts and not assumptions or implicit biases. We all have implicit biases, every single one of us. Having implicit biases in and of itself does not make us prejudiced or discriminatory. It means that our brains have been influenced by our environment, our experiences, childhood, media influences, and our culture. These influences shape our unconscious thinking. It is when we are unaware of these implicit biases and these biases drive our decision making that problems can occur that we would absolutely want to avoid. So according to trainingindustry.com, research shows that there are over 150 different cognitive implicit biases, but some are more apparent in the workplace than in other environments. So specific to our topic around recruiting and hiring, I'm going to go over just a few of the biases that we may be acutely aware of during our recruiting, selection, and hiring processes. The first one is affinity biases. Affinity biases are those biases we have towards people who appear to be similar to ourselves. We tend to want to be around and associate with people who are like us, who have the same interests, ideas, and thoughts as us. But where's the diversity in that? We can't achieve diversity in hiring if we are only selecting and recruiting those who are like us or like those who are already within the organization. Then there's confirmation biases. Confirmation biases is the tendency to look for information that confirms our stereotypical beliefs and ignore the information that may contradict our beliefs. If I can use the example from the previous slide about our millennials and baby boomers, a confirmation bias would say that even though the baby boomer has proven him or herself as being technologically savvy and in tune with all the latest software and applications, because of our own stereotypical beliefs about millennials being better with technology, we ignore those facts about the baby boomer and lean towards our own unconscious thinking, resulting in confirmation bias. Perception biases is the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about certain groups that don't allow members of the group to be seen as individuals with distinctive characteristics. Common perception biases that many of us have all heard are that, Asian people or all Asian people are smart, or all women are overly emotional, or all Muslims are terrorists, or all Black people love watermelon and fried chicken. These are perception biases that we unconsciously refer to when making decisions about people without taking the time to know the person as an individual. Then we have cultural fit biases. How often have we all said this phrase? He or she would be a great cultural fit when we're referring to new hires or candidates. Now, I understand that this is important because there are certain cultures within our organizations that many do not want to disrupt or challenge. But do cultural fits create diversity of thought, creativity, and innovation? Or do cultural fits keep things status quo and homogenous? The cultural fit bias can cause us to overlook a highly qualified candidate because we are biased towards those who will fit more snugly into our organizational cultural box. Then there are disability biases. And these are biases we have against people who are differently abled. Our implicit biases cause us to assume that because they are differently abled, they will not be able to perform well, keep up, or maybe even need more time off from work because of their condition. And therefore, we overlook a potentially highly qualified person who could bring significant value to an organization. Unless otherwise stated by the differently abled person, the assumption should be that the differently abled person can perform the essential functions of the job in which they are applying for. Accent biases. These are implicit biases that automatically assume that because someone has an accent that is not native to the United States, the individual won't be effectively able to communicate or be understood. Decisions based on this are not only bias-driven, but could also speak to discrimination based on a person's national origin. Then there's school affiliations biases. Now, if you're like me, I love my alumni, the Florida State University, go Noles. And my biases, if not careful, could have me to make decisions based upon an individual's attendance or alumni status at Florida State. We tend to give more deference to those who may have attended the same school as us or attended an Ivy League school versus a smaller or HBCU school. These biases will have us to discount highly qualified candidates simply because of our biases with school affiliations. And then lastly, there's outside interest biases. When considering candidates, are we looking for candidates who golf like us or who may hike like us or who have been able to travel internationally like us? Looking at interests that sound more prestigious like polo or horseback riding versus football or softball could create an assumption that the candidate is more refined or more poised and could possibly speak to the candidate's socioeconomic status. Making hire or promotional decisions based on an outside interest is biased and has to be acknowledged. So does implicit biases in hiring really occur, Aisha? Yes. According to industry.com, studies show that white males are given more preference in hiring and promotional decisions. Studies show that tall and or blonde individuals are given more preference in hiring and promotional decisions. Studies also show that younger or middle-aged individuals are given more preference in hiring and promotional decisions. And then Catalyst.org shows that 20% of members of the LGBT community have experienced discrimination when applying for jobs. I'm sure many of you have heard about the numerous case studies that have repeatedly found that resumes with Black sounding or Asian sounding or Hispanic sounding names are least likely to be selected for an interview than resumes with names that sound as if the candidate's race is white. In 2003, the University of Chicago and MIT conducted research where 5,000 identical resumes were sent in response to job openings in Boston and Chicago metro regions. The researchers randomly assigned stereotypical white-sounding names to some resumes and stereotypical Black-sounding names to others. The only difference in all of the resumes that were sent out were the names attached to them. Research found that the resumes with the white-sounding names received 50% more interview invitations than those with Black-sounding names. A more recent study conducted in 2017 by Stanford University, Harvard Business School, and the University of Toronto found that only 11.5% of candidates of Asian descent received a callback for an interview when their resumes reflected an Asian-sounding name. Only 10% of candidates with Black-sounding names received a callback for an interview when their resumes reflected a Black-sounding name. Yet, when those same candidates used the same resume but changed their names to a more stereotypical white-sounding name, the Black applicants received 25% more callbacks for an interview and the Asian candidates received 21% more callbacks for interviews. So does implicit biases occur in recruiting and hiring? Absolutely yes. Now pretend that you are not attending this webinar and you have not become keenly aware of the implicit biases that we all hold. Looking at this picture, which do you think our implicit biases would tell us is the most qualified and usual suspect to be hired for an IT position in Silicon Valley? Don't answer in chat, just think to yourself. Most, if not all of us, if we are honest, selected the Asian male. And if you didn't choose the Asian male but chose someone else, your implicit bias forced you to make a selection based on stereotypical thinking without any information or background of any person in this picture. This is an example of an implicit bias that has taught us to think that Asian males are smart and the most capable for an IT position. Let's try this again. Continue to pretend that you are not attending this webinar and you have not become keenly aware of the implicit biases that we all hold. Looking at this picture, which do you think our implicit biases would tell us is the most qualified and usual suspect to be hired as a kindergarten school teacher? Most, if not all of us, if we are honest, selected the Black or white female. Do you see how our implicit biases, stereotypical and shortcut thinking can cause us to make decisions without any factual information to support our decisions? This is what happens often during our recruiting and hiring processes. So we've talked about how implicit biases can affect recruiting and hiring selections, but now I want to point out how our implicit biases can even affect our practices and promotion processes. Believe it or not, our implicit biases can affect how lenient and flexible we are with some versus with others. Are we more understanding with someone when they are like us, or someone who is more like us and has a need to take time off from work, or may need some additional explanations of their role than those who are less like us, or who we may need to have less in common with? Are we less likely to discipline some and not others? An unconscious lack of consistency in leniency, flexibility, and disciplinary actions can speak to implicit biases or maybe even discrimination. Or how about those we repeatedly select for exposure opportunities or for those interesting projects and extensive trainings? Are we constantly selecting the same people? Do we have our go-to person that we've grown accustomed to using because they are easier to work with or they fit that company culture for leadership opportunities? Has this now limited others from being able to showcase their potential and skills? Our implicit biases could be influencing us in these areas. In that same vein, when it comes to praise and recognition, who gets it? Are those who we expect good things from because we have a favorable implicit bias towards them, the ones who receive praise and recognition, while those who we may not have a favorable bias towards are never praised, recognized, or awarded for their hard work and successes? And lastly, and more obvious, promotions based on favoritism and not merit is a clear indication of bias, either implicit or explicitly. So how do these implicit biases that we all share impact our organizations? For starters, our implicit biases can lead to homogeneous organizations, which is the direct opposite of a diverse organization. Homogeneous organizations are those that are filled with wonderful people, but people who are all alike, whether that be racially, from a gender perspective, age, national origin, religious beliefs, socioeconomic status, or any other of the affinity biases we have discussed. While a homogeneous organization can be successful and productive, studies have shown that diverse organizations can be successful and are much more productive and profitable. We'll talk more about that in a future slide. Implicit biases also impact an organization's creativity and innovation. The Office of Personnel Management has stated that diversity and inclusion increases a company's innovation. Think about it. If everyone is the same and thinks alike, Where will the fresh ideas, the fresh innovation, and different perspectives where will they come from that's going to move the company forward? Another impact of the organization is found in leadership positions. If the workforce is homogenous, then the leadership team and those in key decision-making roles will lack diversity as well. Many of you have heard of the company Insights, and for those of you who haven't, Insights is a leading corporation that helps companies to develop and achieve their business goals through personnel development. Insights has stated that diversity at the leadership level is beneficial to build relationships with your customer base and to meet business objectives. An additional impact implicit biases may have to your organization is that implicit biases that lead to a homogeneous workforce also creates risk for potential legal liabilities. Applicants who feel as if they were not selected because of their race, gender, age, sexual orientation, or any other protected category can make a claim of discrimination in hiring. If your workforce is not diverse, it could suggest that a decision not to hire a diverse candidate is part of a systematic process designed to have a negative, disparate impact on particular groups of people. And as you know, ladies and gentlemen, this is illegal. And with illegal processes come the financial costs of litigation, settlements, or both. Finally, implicit biases and homogeneous workforces minimizes the ability to have an inclusive workforce. So what do I mean when I use the term inclusion or inclusive workforce? I have heard many definitions for the term inclusion. One of the more popular analogies was coined by Verna Myers, and she said, diversity is being invited to the party, while inclusion is being asked to dance while at the party. Many say that the word inclusion can be used interchangeably with the word belonging. However, I believe inclusion involves 3 A's, those A's being acceptance, acknowledgement, and appreciation of diverse characteristics. Inclusion means that you have accepted me into your organization and you have acknowledged my presence and my differences, and you appreciate my diverse characteristics. While inclusion speaks to acceptance, acknowledgement, and appreciation, diversity speaks to representation and numbers. It's easy to check the box for diversity because it's a numbers game. But inclusion is the magic sauce and not as easily achieved or measured. It is possible to be diverse and not inclusive because you can have a diverse workforce, but your diverse staff may not feel accepted, acknowledged, or appreciated. But it is impossible to be inclusive without being diverse. Remember, the last A in our definition of inclusion stands for appreciation of diverse characteristics. We cannot be inclusive without the presence of diverse characteristics and individuals. So when recruiting for diversity, keep in mind that there are 2 types of diversity to consider. There's inherent diversity, which are the inherent characteristics that we are born with, like race, sex, age, national origin. And then there's acquired diversity, which are those things that are acquired and subject to changing, such as education, experience, skills, values, gender. Now, if you notice, sex and gender are included under both the inherent and acquired categories. This is because it is important to consider transgender individuals whose inherent sex at birth is different from the gender that they may have currently acquired or aligned with. Important to also remember is that as recent as June of this year, our Supreme Court ruled that sexual orientation and gender identity or gender expression are included in the definition of sex. Therefore, employers may not make employment decisions based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So why is any of this important? What can this focus on diversity and inclusion do for my business? What's in this for me? Well, I am glad you asked those questions. I mentioned earlier that I would share a few statistics on how diversity and inclusion impacts an organization's profitability and productivity. So according to McKinsey and Company PwC, 85% of companies with a formal D&I program showed an improved bottom line. 33% is how much more productive businesses can be with a diverse workforce. And then 43% of businesses which have a diverse board of directors are more likely to realize higher profits. And while having a diverse workforce is great, having a diverse and inclusive workforce is phenomenal. And here's why. Organizations that have achieved inclusion with their diversity are filled with employees who feel accepted, acknowledged, and appreciated. And employees who feel this way are happy about coming to work and happy to be a part of the organization. High turnover is less likely when employees are happy, which consequently means retention rates are high. Happy employees tend to have high employee morale, which leads to high employee productivity. And an article written in Forbes magazine says that employees' productivity directly correlates with their morale levels. As shown in the previous slide, your financial bottom line is also improved when diversity and inclusion is present. So let's return back to the topic of implicit biases and how we can make sure that these biases do not manifest in our hiring practices. This slide shares some of the more common strategies to put into practice. First, you would want to use a neutral language in the job description and announcement. What do I mean by neutral language? Well, Francesca Gino, a professor at Harvard Business School, says that even subtle word choices can have an impact on the individuals who elect to apply for a position. Research shows that masculine language that uses adjectives like competitive and determined results in women perceiving that they will not feel a sense of belonging in that organization. On the other hand, words like collaborative and cooperative tend to draw more women than men. Now, there are several software programs available to help organizations counteract this effect by suggesting more gender-neutral descriptors and verbs. And I'm aware of a few software programs that you may be interested in taking a look at. This is not an endorsement of any of these products, but I just wanted to share a few of them with you. Some are, one is named Text Analyzer, then there's Textio, Gender Decoder, and Talvista. Secondly, the blind resume approach is another method many recruiters are starting to use to avoid implicit biases. Now, this blind resume approach is similar to the reality TV show The Voice, which I'm sure many of us have seen, or at least seen advertising for it. During this reality TV show, The Voice, judges turn their backs on the auditioning singer as not to be able to see them or any of their demographics. The judge can only hear the auditioner's voice and can only make a judgment or assessment based on what they are hearing. Essentially, the judge is blind to all other factors except the one thing that the judge is to be focused on, which is the auditioner's voice. The same concept can be applied when reviewing resumes. Before reviewing for qualifications and experience, ask someone who is not responsible for reviewing the resumes to redact them by removing names, addresses, or any other factor that may be an indicator of an applicant's race or gender. Once all redactions are completed, the recruiter can then begin the assessment process and can then only focus on skills and experiences. Thirdly, Francesca Gino of Harvard Business School recommends structured interviews where each candidate is asked the same set of defined questions. This minimizes bias by leveling the playing field and giving each candidate the same opportunity to respond to the same question. Giving a skills test that mimics the kinds of tasks a candidate will be doing on the job is also a great way for recruiters and hiring managers to make hiring decisions based on competency and capability and not any type of biases. Another way to avoid implicit biases is hiring to set diversity goals. We will talk a little bit more about what this means in a future slide, but essentially, at the end of every hiring process, leaders should track how well they have done against the diversity goals that have been established for the organization. And lastly, Implicit bias training for those involved in the recruiting or hiring process is never a bad idea. Let's talk a little bit about implicit bias training. We can all recall the April 2018 incident where two Black men entered a Philadelphia-based Starbucks restaurant and took seats at a table without making a purchase. The manager of that particular Starbucks asked the men to leave, and the men told the manager that they were waiting for an acquaintance. The manager proceeded to call the police, and when the police arrived, the men were put in handcuffs, escorted out of the restaurant, and detained for 9 hours before being released. The men were waiting in Starbucks for their acquaintance, who we now know was white and who was also a business associate. They were having a business or planning to have a business meeting. This incident garnered national attention and led to protests of the Starbucks chain. Starbucks responded swiftly, and in the following month, all of the company's outlets in the United States, which was nearly 8,000 of them, closed their doors for one afternoon to conduct implicit bias training with managers and staff. Now, while this was a great step in the right direction for Starbucks, effective implicit bias training should not be considered to be the solution and quick fix. It is only the beginning to an awareness of the presence of biases that we all have and should serve as a catalyst for continued learning in the area of diversity and inclusion. Implicit bias training should be introspective. It should promote empathy. It should be a conversation starter. It should be collaborative in its learning approach. It should be ongoing learning, and it should be a commitment to tangible changes. There are mixed results or reactions on the efficacy of implicit bias training. And using the Starbucks case study, employees who were interviewed immediately after attending the Starbucks training, they shared different experiences. Some said that the training was a great start to what they hoped would be continuous learning. There were those of color who were annoyed that they were required to attend a training on something that they experienced through the course of their daily lives. Others said there was too much focus on Black and white experiences while ignoring other groups of color and their experiences. Implicit bias training alone will not solve the problem. Simply making individuals aware of their implicit biases is not enough. Training and action must be continual and all-inclusive. Implicit bias training is a unique form of diversity training because conversations on implicit biases requires for us to start with a hard look in the mirror and to be introspective. Conversations that are held during implicit bias training can sometimes cause emotional distress or even a defensive reaction because oftentimes when we are truly being introspective, what we may find may be inconsistent with the idealized version that we have of ourselves. Therefore, implicit bias trainings can only be effective when there is a balance between psychological safety and a commitment to changing behavior. And finally, implicit bias awareness is not only for individuals. Companies must truly consider whether there are structural and organizational biases embedded within an organization that need to be changed. One of the changes Starbucks' CEO made after this incident was to implement a new policy that allows people to sit in their stores or use their restrooms without purchasing anything. Are there any organizational biases that need reviewing within your organization? So what are the responsibilities of recruiters and hiring managers to avoid implicit biases? Well, for starters, we want to disrupt bias at the sourcing stage. Seek opportunities to source diverse candidates at the places where they can be found, such as HBCUs, professional networks, chambers of commerce. Ensure that there is a balanced slate is present. Make sure your finalist or shortlist for hire includes a diverse selection pool. You also would want to use unbiased language during the interview. Gender-neutral descriptive words should be used. We want to also minimize being over complimentary or critical during an interview process. I always tell my clients that you want to remain neutral during the interview. Keep your poker face on. As business owners and leaders, what are our responsibilities in diversity and inclusion? First, diversity and inclusion has to be a priority for leaders. It cannot be an afterthought or something we are considering for the moment. Many believe that recent events related to George Floyd and the subsequent social unrest has led to an awakening for business leaders to want to do more in the area of diversity and inclusion. And those of us who work in this DE&I space are thrilled about this, and we're hopeful that this is not just a momentary decision, and that business owners and leaders will commit to making diversity and inclusion a part of their overall business strategy. That overall business strategy to include, yes, your recruiting strategy, but also your marketing strategy, your vendor and supplier strategy, your business-to-business relationships and strategies, your succession planning, your corporate and social responsibilities, and even your finances. Continuing on, this slide reflects a few more responsibilities for business owners and leaders in the area of recruiting and hiring for diversity and inclusion. Companies have found success in their diversity and inclusion efforts, and they've done so because they have made it a requirement for their recruiters and hiring managers to recruit with diversity in mind, and have even tied performance and compensation goals to their D&I efforts. A 2014 report on corporate diversity in Fortune 100 companies found that 55% of companies tied performance on meeting diversity goals to a portion of their executive compensation. As such, many hiring managers will not begin the interview process until there is a diverse candidate pool presented to them to select from. Research shows that when a pool of qualified diverse candidates is used for selection, the rate at which a diverse candidate is hired is significantly increased. Business owners and leaders should also ensure that their branding showcases their diversity. This is where the marketing strategy comes into play. Does your marketing strategy reflect your diversity efforts and commitment? Word of caution here. Make sure your marketing is not just a feel-good story or words. There must be action behind your efforts and stated commitment. And finally, commit to identifying and developing an action plan to build or improve inclusivity. If your organization does not currently have a dedicated professional to lead your D&I efforts, I highly recommend that you seek the assistance of a professional service or consultant to help guide you in your strategy development and efforts. So I'll end my presentation today with a quote from Sheryl Sandberg, the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook. We are building products and services that people with very diverse backgrounds use. And I think we all want our company makeup to reflect the makeup of the people who use our products and services. So as you think about how implicit biases may impact your business, think about the people you serve, the people you engage with, and the people who spend money for your products or your service. Does your company reflect your customer base? Does your company create an environment where innovation and creativity can be maximized to exceed your customers' needs? And lastly, and in my opinion, the most important, are your employees happy and feel as if they can come to work each day knowing that they are a part of an environment where their diverse characteristics are accepted, acknowledged, and appreciated? Thank you for your time today. If you would like to connect with me for to take a deeper dive in any of these topics that we've discussed, or for questions or for follow-up, feel free to reach me at alliance@insperity.com. Now I'll be more than happy to take any questions that may be coming from our participants.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Aisha. And let's get to some of those questions. We've had some come in advance and some over the course of time, but I'm going to start with one that actually you kind of ended with. You talked about prioritizing diversity inclusion, and the role of business owners and leaders. Where do you typically see the blind spots in leadership teams so that they can actually look out for them of all the areas you mentioned?
Sure. I think the common blind spots or biases are the ones that I mentioned early on in the presentation. You know, those affinity biases, those confirmation biases, because we move about unconsciously, making decisions and taking actions, blinded to the fact that we may be taking actions or making decisions based on any type of bias that we may have against or favorable towards a particular group. And so those common blind spots or biases like affinity and confirmation and like interest or the cultural fit for our organization, or even my favorite, the school affiliation, those are some of those blind spots that we have to be cognizant and aware of.
Okay. Is there ever a case that any of those biases that they are good at all? Is there ever a case like that?
They can be good if they are not having a disparate impact or negative impact on those who the favorable bias is not towards. So you want to make sure that you're not being, the goal is to not be exclusionary towards any particular group. The goal is to make sure that, you know, going back to inclusivity, that everyone feels included or that they're being treated the same way, or everyone's on the same playing field with any type of decision making or hiring practice or action that is taken.
How do you work on improving implicit bias when leadership might be biased themselves? Meaning, like, how do we help influence decision making if we feel our hands are tied?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And, you know, this whole movement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it really starts at the top. There has to be buy-in at the top level. Leadership has to be able to understand that implicit biases do occur, and understand that it's not something that makes anyone a bad person or a racist person or a prejudiced person or a discriminatory person. Implicit biases are something that we all have, each and every one of us. The idea is to become more aware or become cognizant that these implicit biases occur, or that we share them. And once we become aware of that, then we can begin to make the shift or move the needle to making decisions and taking actions that are not biased in nature. So in terms of leadership and helping leadership understand, that's really challenging. It helps when leadership is able to sit in on these type of trainings to get a better understanding, because I think that oftentimes we hear implicit bias and we think that immediately that makes us a bad person, and it doesn't. You know, it just causes or forces us or means that we need to be a little bit more introspective.
Yeah, well, speaking of Sheryl Sandberg, you ended with one of her quotes, and some of the things I've been reading a lot about is the kind of the conflict of how companies are offering working parents flexibility or time off or things like that. And it
Right.
almost seems like there's some sort of bias that's emerging against working parents. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, actually, I've seen a lot of that, and what I caution employees on, because oftentimes we hear about working moms, right, or single moms, or women being impacted with, you know, particularly by the pandemic and needing to have more flexibility at home with the children. Well, what about working dads? What about single dads, right? What about single fathers who have the same, who are experiencing the same thing? And so, first and foremost, let's make sure that when we're talking about the flexibility for women or moms, we're also talking about the flexibility for men and fathers who may be in that same position. And I think the idea behind the flexibility around it is making sure that we're extending grace to all of our employees, and we're being lenient with everyone, especially in these unprecedented times that none of us have ever in our lifetime have seen or experienced. So let's just make sure that if we are allowing single mom or women to be at home and be flexible with their work schedule because of children, that we're affording that same type of flexibility and we're extending that same grace to our our male employees and our single dads or our single fathers who find themselves in the same position.
Yeah,
That
thank you.
eliminates the bias.
Definitely. I remember being young in my career and not having kids and managing people who did have children and their need for time off when they were sick. And I think about now how much more empathy I would have, and grace, I love that word,
Mm-hmm.
than maybe I did as a young manager.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you actually measure implicit bias? Are there any tools to be able to quantify what they are, to determine what exists?
Yeah, so implicit biases are hard to measure or quantify because often we don't know that they even exist, right? So
Yeah.
it's hard to account for something that you don't know is there. The goal is to start becoming aware, and we do so by attending these type of trainings, by taking the implicit association test that you heard me mention during the presentation, and again, becoming more introspective and beginning to question and challenge our own decision making. You know, we always talk about challenging the status quo. Well, we have to begin to challenge our own status quo.
Yeah, definitely. I remember reading with some of the racial tension that was emerging, one of our members did an audit and they looked at exactly what you said, their employees, their leadership team, their vendors, customers, just trying to determine, where they fell on the scale. And I thought that was a very proactive approach to take, and not just looking, internally, but all of the people they engaged with.
Sure.
Couple more organizational level questions, and then we'll get
Mm-hmm.
into some questions related more to hiring. But there is obviously a lot of racial tension right now. And what are some recommendations you have for leaders to help relieve that?
Yeah. So, and let's remove the word racial from this question, right? And
Yeah.
let's ask the question, what steps can we take to relieve tension? And think about some of the strategies that you would employ to mitigate and eliminate any type of tension, right? I think the very first thing we would do as savvy business leaders is we would engage in those very difficult and uncomfortable conversations that we've all learned and are still learning how to have with our employees. The very first step to relieving any type of tension is to have those difficult conversations. And in those difficult conversations, what we're doing is we're seeking to understand. We're seeking to understand different perspectives. We're seeking to understand different emotions. And we're creating environments during these difficult conversations where employees feel as if it's safe to be transparent. This is critical and crucial to having these conversations. And actually, I like to refer to these conversations, these difficult conversations, as listening sessions, because in having these conversations, we have to listen, and we have to listen without becoming defensive. Listen without becoming confrontational, right? Listen without becoming or opposing. We are listening and we're seeking to understand. And then once we've had these listening sessions as leaders, we can then begin to figure out action plans or action items that we can take to help relieve this tension. It never hurts to ask an employee, what can I do to help you feel more comfortable in your work environment? Ask. Employees will tell you. And as a matter of fact, I also encourage some of my clients to create diversity inclusion councils or employee resource groups, because it is these type of groups that will begin to help you think through ideas and come up with mitigating efforts that will help relieve that tension. And as leaders, we're charged to leading these efforts. And it goes back to the question you asked a little while ago about leadership and what happens if, people at the top are not quite there yet, right? The organization won't see the importance or think that this is important unless they see their leaders taking a stand and taking actions towards moving this needle.
Yeah, so kind of a follow-up question, someone is asking about struggling with racial
Mm-hmm.
diversity, and
Sure.
do they need to find a manager level person to start? Is it required to actually be a position or at a leadership level? or, where I like your idea about the committee, and that might have answered that question too.
Yeah. So, I talk about at the latter part of my presentation, I talked about, best practice is to hire a consultant or have a dedicated D&I professional within your organization. I understand that not organizations have the bandwidth to do that. I get it, right? So, and quite honestly, diversity, equity, and inclusion is all of our responsibilities. It does not just necessarily land in the lap of managers, supervisors, or executive leadership. Everyone within the organization is responsible for making sure that there's a feeling of inclusion and acceptance and appreciation and acknowledgement throughout the organization. So to the participants' question, no, it doesn't necessarily have to be a manager. There can be diversity and inclusion councils or groups of staff members who have decided that, hey, we want to form an employee resource group to help leadership understand where we stand, to help leadership understand this is where we feel as an organization. This is what we believe may help relieve some of the tension that is occurring within the organization. So I don't think that it necessarily has to be a manager. Staff level can absolutely take the initiative to present or propose these type of initiatives or efforts to their management or leadership staff.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's pivot a little bit to hiring in the last few minutes that we have together.
Sure.
So obviously, in order to be able to promote people into manager positions, and when you're looking at diversity and inclusion, you actually have to start with hiring them at some level. So
right.
yeah, so you've talked about using testing as part of hiring to be able to remove some of that bias. Do you have something you consider to be a best-in-class behavioral assessment tool?
Yeah. So the Harvard Implicit Association Test is the tool that's most frequently used to assess whether or not implicit biases are present. And I particularly like the IAT, Implicit Association Test, because it allows the users to select from different type of assessments. So there's an assessment on race, gender, and sexual orientation biases. There's an assessment that you can take to determine whether or not there's any biases towards mental and physical health conditions. There's an assessment that you can take to determine whether or not you have any type of just social or cultural biases. And so I really, really like the IAT. And quite honestly, I'm not familiar with any other tool that explicitly tests for implicit biases. However, there are other personality tools or assessments that I think are really good resources or tools for organizations to use, such as DISC. I know many of us have heard of DISC. And there's another 16personalities.com that I really like that tests the personalities and kind of put your finger on where a person stands in their cultural beliefs. And then there's also Strength Finders. Strength Finders is also a good one to use to determine or to make or to gauge a person's skill set and performance expectations.
Great, excellent. That was a great call out with DISC and StrengthsFinder as some tools. With some other tools, so like an applicant tracking system. Do you think that you talked about using some of those systems to help remedy unconscious bias? Do you think that would help, or could they actually hurt also?
Well, employee tracking systems that are going to help minimize implicit biases, I think would help. So in the presentation, I mentioned a little bit about some of the softwares that are out there that provide or assist with gender neutral language, right? And some of the softwares that can help with blind screening or blind resumes. I think that those are some of the applications and softwares that organizations can consider or, just look into if they're thinking about or moving towards removing implicit biases from their recruiting and hiring strategies.
So if someone is having a difficult time, whether it's Black or another race, locating, a specific role, because maybe the population, like there's just not the demographics in the area, or that they're not attracting them, even though it's a well-respected company in the community for supporting causes without prejudice. How can those companies who are really seeking in a smaller talent pool, how can they be more successful in attracting diverse employees?
Well, I think it starts with where are you looking for your diverse candidates? So it starts with the sourcing, right? So are you tapping into your community's Black or Hispanic or Asian chamber of commerces? Are you looking at or tapping into the professional associations for diverse groups of people? There's so many professional networks for all groups of people for all industries. All you have to do is just Google them. You also may want to consider as an organization, what does your digital footprint look like? Does your digital footprint attract diverse people? Do you portray your company on your website as a company that is going to be inclusive and supportive of everyone? Do you talk about your commitment to diversity on your website? Because these are all things that job seekers look for when they're looking for employment. Just as we are interviewing candidates for employment, those same candidates are interviewing us to see whether or not we're an organization or a company that they want to be with. And so, when we're talking about trying to recruit for more diverse candidates, beyond just the sourcing, we have to take a step back and look at us as the organization or as the company. What are we putting out there that will make a diverse candidate want to be a part of our organization?
Yeah. So when you talk about the website and having employee testimonials, really seeking out those diverse employees to have testimonials from them so people can see there's people like me. It accommodates, working parents. It accommodates people who have different races and genders, et cetera.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, as I mentioned in the presentation, do you have a diversity and inclusion statement? Have you formulated a statement that you are committed to that goes on your website for everyone to see? And then not only just the statement, what actions do you have that support or reflect the statement that you made on your website? We're in this day and age where social media and internet surfing is what many people spend a lot of their time doing. So you want to find out what's out there about your organization. What do your Glassdoor reviews look like? What are people saying on social media about your company? Because I can guarantee you, job seekers are looking at those things when they're considering whether or not they want to be a part of your organization, and could potentially be part of the drawback when you're recruiting or trying to source for diverse applicants. It may be the drawback of what's being seen and said on social media that could be causing you some challenges.
Yeah, that's a great thing to audit as well. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights today, Aisha. Great takeaways for our attendees, and we'll send a recording of today's webinar within 24 hours, as well as a PDF of the slides. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So if you are a VISTAGE member, we have 2 exclusive engagements this month as part of our Leading and Challenging Times series. Next week, watch for Joe Galvin's email for an engaging presentation from retired Navy SEAL and co-author of The Dichotomy of Leadership, Jocko Willink. Jocko shares key concepts from his books, delving into battle-tested leadership best practices that you can apply to your business. And on September 25th, Dr. Paul Auwaerter, Clinical Director of Infectious Disease at Johns Hopkins, will share his insights on effective therapeutics that are emerging, clinical trials underway for several potential vaccines, and more on the current pandemic. So look forward to those 2 sessions. Thank you so much for your time today, and stay safe.